The world of high finance and global power is built on a lie. The belief that debt is merely a tool, a lever for growth, manageable by the right hands. For decades, the architects of modern American financial policy, the interconnected families of power, and the anonymous technocrats in Washington and on Wall Street have insisted that the United States is immune. They claim that America's status as the reserve currency, the largest economy, and the global military guarantor grants it a protective shield, an exceptionalism that history will honor. This is the dangerous illusion of every dying empire, and it is about to shatter. What the elites deliberately ignore is that collapse is not a random event. It is a mechanical, mathematical certainty governed by a precise, seven-stage pattern. This is the debt-death spiral, a blueprint written in the bankruptcy of three vastly different empires across 3 centuries. From the silver-fueled Spanish Empire of the 1500s to the vast, declining Ottoman Empire of the 1800s, right up to the modern, hyper-financialized Japanese economy, the script remains unchanged. Stage by stage, trillion by trillion, they followed this path to collapse, and right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same script. Before we track this mechanical collapse, you must understand its ultimate logic. A debt-death spiral is not a theory you find in a textbook. It is a point of no return where a nation is forced to borrow merely to pay the interest on previous debt, transforming its national treasury into the world's largest Ponzi scheme. It begins not with crisis, but with success. A logical belief that borrowing for strategic investment will pay off, funding infrastructure, military expansion, or social programs. For a while, the borrowed money creates growth, generating tax revenue that theoretically pays the debt. It is sustainable, until growth inevitably stops. When growth slows, the debt remains, and the interest payments are still due. At this inflection point, governments face an agonizing choice that is always political suicide. Either cut spending to match revenue, or raise taxes drastically. Since politically, cutting spending means recession, and raising taxes means losing power, they choose the path of least resistance, borrowing more to cover the shortfall. This is the precise moment the spiral begins. When you borrow just to cover the interest, you are no longer investing in the future. You are simply postponing the crisis. The debt grows faster than the economy, the interest payments consume a larger and larger share of the budget, and the math becomes mathematically impossible. The end state is a complete breakdown of confidence. When bond markets, the global lenders realize you are mathematically insolvent, they stop lending. At that point, there are only 2 catastrophic options left: default or inflate the currency to pay the debt with worthless money. Both options destroy the economy. Both options end the empire. The United States is currently burdened with more debt, $36 trillion and climbing, than all 3 of these historical empires combined at their peak. Our annual interest payments alone now exceed $1.1 trillion, more than the entire defense budget. And yet, we continue to borrow $2 trillion more every year just to keep the machine running. We are not heading toward this spiral. We are deep within it. History is screaming a warning. The U.S. is already in stage 5 of 7, and the pattern dictates that stages 6 and 7 come fast. The story of how empires borrow themselves to death, why they always believe they can manage it, and why the math says we are next, is a mechanical collapse that began centuries ago. This 7-stage mechanical collapse is as follows. Stage 1. Borrow for productive investment or expansion. Every debt spiral begins with reasonable borrowing, using debt for legitimate, high-return goals, wars, infrastructure, or modernization. Stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't stop. The return on investment diminishes, but political pressure ensures that spending continues because cutting it means recession and tax increases mean political suicide. Stage 3. Borrow to pay previous debt, Ponzi phase. This is the critical transition where new borrowing is no longer for investment, but for servicing old debt. The crisis is now being postponed, not solved. Stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable. Math breaks. Debt service consumes a disproportionately large percentage of government revenue, 30–50%, making core government functions impossible without further borrowing. Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence or government trapped. Foreign or domestic creditors refuse to lend, or the government is trapped by low interest rates, unable to raise them without bankrupting the budget. Stage 6. Default, hyperinflation, or lost decades. The inevitable consequence: outright default, printing currency until it becomes worthless, or decades of crushing economic stagnation. Stage 7. Economic collapse or permanent decline. The empire is over. The prosperity, the power, and the future are gone. The illusion that American exceptionalism will negate the immutable laws of mathematics is merely a comforting lie. History has already provided the test cases for our collapse, and we must now deconstruct them. To grasp the inevitability of the U.S. financial trajectory, we must first analyze the original blueprints for collapse: the debt spirals of Spain and the Ottoman Empire. These were massive, generation-spanning imperial systems, fundamentally different from one another, yet destroyed by the exact same mathematical sequence. The first great debt spiral was Spain, spanning the years 1500 to 1650. This was the original blueprint, demonstrating that unlimited resources do not save an empire if spending consistently exceeds revenue. The journey began in the early 1500s when Spanish conquistadors seized control of the richest gold and silver mines in history, primarily the Potosi silver mine in Bolivia, which alone produced 45,000 tons of silver over 2 centuries. Spain minted this silver into coins and became the wealthiest nation on earth, a superpower upon whose territories the sun never set. This massive influx of wealth provided the perfect environment for Stage 1: borrow for productive investment or expansion. King Charles V was constantly at war against France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant rebels across Europe, wars that required massive armies, fleets, and weapons across multiple continents. He funded it all with debt, borrowing from German and Italian bankers, and offering the silver from the Americas as collateral. Lenders believed Spain could always pay because the silver kept flowing, even as the debt grew constantly between 1,500 and 1,650. The empire entered Stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't stop by the mid-1500s. The military campaigns began costing more than the silver revenues could cover. When King Philip II inherited the throne in 1556, he also inherited 36 million ducats in debt, equivalent to about $3 billion today. An enormous sum for the time. Philip not only kept spending fighting the Ottomans and attempting to conquer England with the Spanish Armada, but he funded it all with borrowed money. By 1557, just 1 year into his reign, the mathematics broke. Tax revenues were 7 million ducats per year, but debt service consumed 5 million, meaning interest alone ate up 70% of government revenue. The foundational architects of the empire were now facing a solvency crisis. This immediately triggered Stage 3. Borrow to pay previous debt, Ponzi phase. In September 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy, defaulting on his debts, suspending all payments, and unilaterally converting the loans to long-term bonds at lower interest rates. The bankers were trapped. They had to accept the restructuring or get nothing. But a sovereign default doesn't solve the problem. It only resets the clock. Philip immediately resumed borrowing to fund his continuing wars, and lenders, convinced by the continuing flow of silver, lent to him again. This cycle of default and borrowing repeated in 1560, 1575, and 1596 to 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. Each time, the debt spiral only worsened. By the time Spain hit Stage 4, interest payments become unsustainable. Math breaks. The situation was catastrophic. By the end of Philip's reign in 1598, debt service consumed a staggering 100% of revenue. Every coin that flowed in went straight to creditors, leaving nothing for government operations, military, or infrastructure. The empire had become a zombie empire, mathematically insolvent and dependent entirely on new debt, with lenders charging punitive interest rates of 18–20% because Spain was a terrible credit risk. The final crisis arrived with Stage 5, lenders lose confidence or government trapped. By the early 1600s, lenders refused to lend, or the interest rates made borrowing worse. Spain, desperate, attempted to debase the currency, mixing copper into silver coins, and inflation by fraud that destroyed trust. Prices exploded, the economy seized up, and the silver, instead of staying in Spain, flowed immediately out to pay for imports. Spain, having failed to build domestic industries, was dependent on imports from France, England, and the Netherlands. the countries that were actually building while Spain merely extracted and spent. This mathematical collapse directly led to the loss of Portugal in 1640 and the Netherlands in 1648, diminishing Spain to a second-rate, irrelevant power. Fast forward 2.5 centuries to the Ottoman Empire, 1,851,923, which demonstrated that the pattern is absolute regardless of the era. The vast, 500-year-old empire was declining, losing wars and territory, but desperately seeking to modernize. This was the Ottoman Stage 1. Borrow for productive investment or expansion. Starting in the 1852s, the government borrowed heavily from European banks, French, British, and German, to modernize the military, build railroads, telegraph lines, and ports. Ottoman leaders believed modernization would restore power, and European lenders saw the empire as too big to fail and a necessary buffer against Russia. However, the empire swiftly entered Stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't stop. Modernization failed to generate the expected economic growth. Railroads didn't create industry, the modernized military still lost wars, and much of the borrowed money was simply stolen by corrupt officials or wasted on palace luxuries. While tax revenues fell due to a shrinking empire, debt payments continued to rise. By the early 1872s, the Ottomans entered Stage 3, borrow to pay previous debt, Ponzi phase, taking out new loans simply to pay interest on old ones. Lenders continued to lend, believing European governments would intervene. But in October 1875, the empire declared bankruptcy. The inevitable arrival of Stage 4, interest payments become unsustainable math breaks in the Ottoman Empire, was immediate and brutal. Unlike Spain, the Ottomans lost control of the process entirely. In 1881, the Decree of Muharrem established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration (OPDA). European creditors took direct control of Ottoman finances, seizing tax collection and customs revenues. This was the Ottoman Stage 5, lenders lose confidence or government trapped. The empire became a debt colony, technically sovereign, but economically controlled by foreign creditors. For 30 years, creditors extracted wealth, preventing the government from borrowing or investing. Without funds, the empire fractured. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania became independent, and European powers carved up the remaining territory. World War I delivered the final, fatal blow, and the empire was formally dissolved in 1923. This transition from Stage 5 to Stages 6 and 7 was swift and absolute, ending in dissolution. The lesson of both Spain and the Ottomans is that the political systems may resist fiscal correction, but mathematics always wins. The mechanical certainty of the debt-death spiral is further illuminated by the case of Japan, which provides the modern template for economic stagnation, a slow, agonizing decline rather than a sudden geopolitical collapse. Japan's experience is crucial because it introduces the concept of modern monetary tricks that postpone, but ultimately cannot stop, the pattern. In the 1980 seconds, Japan was viewed as unstoppable. Its economy grew 10% per year. Japanese corporations were buying American landmarks. Sony purchased Columbia Pictures and Mitsubishi bought Rockefeller Center. Analysts widely predicted Japan would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. This success led directly to a massive asset bubble, which became the modern equivalent of Stage 1. Borrow for productive investment or expansion. Except the investment was in speculation, not production. Japanese real estate and stock prices exploded. By December 1989, the Nikkei stock index reached 38,915. This was not based on fundamentals, but on speculation fueled by cheap credit, with banks lending recklessly and corporations borrowing massively. The bubble burst, and Japan was immediately faced with Stage 3. Borrow to pay previous debt, Ponzi phase, bypassing a true Stage 2 because the crisis was so acute. Throughout the 1990 seconds, Japan tried to spend its way out of stagnation. Every time the economy slowed, the government announced new stimulus packages, more borrowing, more debt. Critically, this strategy failed because the fundamental problem, the bad debts clogging the banking system, was never fixed. The economy became choked by zombie companies, businesses that were technically insolvent but kept alive by cheap loans. They existed only to drain resources, not to invest, hire, or grow. As a result, Japan's debt to GDP ratio soared 128% by 2000, 200% by 2010. Today, in 2025, it stands at an astronomical 264% of GDP. This should have triggered Stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable. Math breaks years ago. But Japan found a cheat code that allows it to remain trapped in Stage 5, unable to advance, but unable to retreat. This cheat code is debt monetization. The Bank of Japan, the central bank, buys most of the government debt. The government issues bonds, and the central bank buys them with printed money. This mechanical action keeps interest rates artificially near zero. Even with debt to GDP at 264%, Japan pays less than 2% of GDP in interest. This artificially suppressed rate is the system's life support. This mechanism defines Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence or government trapped. Japan is trapped in a spiral. It cannot raise interest rates without instantaneously blowing up its budget. If interest rates rose to just 2%, Japan's interest payments would consume 5% of GDP. At 5%, they would consume 13% of GDP, making the budget impossible to manage. Furthermore, Japan cannot cut spending because of its aging and shrinking population, which causes social security costs to explode. Japan's current state is not a sudden collapse, but a lost century of stagnation. The country is slowly dying in slow motion. Wages haven't increased since 1990. An entire generation has lived their working lives in stagnation, unable to afford homes or start families. The population, which peaked in 2008, is projected to fall below 100 million by 2050. The math simply does not work. The lesson of Japan is absolute. Modern monetary tricks can postpone the debt spiral, but they cannot stop it. Japan has bought 35 years of time, but the debt still exists, the demographics still deteriorate, and the math remains impossible. They are stuck in Stage 5, waiting for the inevitable choice between hyperinflation, when the currency breaks from too much printing, or the lost decades becoming a lost century. These three empires, Spain, the Ottomans, and Japan, are the three warnings written in bankruptcy and collapse. They prove that the pattern is mathematical and absolute. The United States is following this exact sequence. Stage 1 and 2 long past. The U.S. began borrowing heavily in the 1,980 seconds under Reagan. Debt was $900 billion in 1,980. We are now at $36 trillion. Debt was used for military expansion, social programs, and tax cuts. Growth has steadily declined, averaging 4% in the 1,960 seconds to 1.5% in the 2020 seconds. But spending has soared from $2 trillion to $6 trillion budgets in 20 years. Stage 3 Ponzi phase. We are deep in the Ponzi phase. Of the $2 trillion the U.S. borrows annually, approximately $1.1 trillion goes straight to interest payments, new debt used to service old debt. Stage 4 math breaks. Entry point. The U.S. is currently entering Stage 4. Interest payments of $1.1 trillion are more than defense spending. That is 15% of tax revenue. If interest rates return to the historical average of 5%, interest payments would double to $2 trillion, consuming a shocking 30% of revenue. This is the mathematical threshold of unsustainability. The mechanical pressure of Stage 4 is now colliding with the political impossibility of Stage 5, making the current moment the most dangerous in American financial history. The United States is now firmly locked into Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence or government trapped, a point of mechanical equilibrium that is unstable and unsustainable. The political and economic elites within the U.S., the financial system, believe they have found a unique escape route, but the historical pattern reveals they are merely trapped in a far more dangerous phase than Spain or the Ottomans ever faced. The trap is the dual impossibility created by decades of unchecked borrowing. On one hand, the government cannot cut spending, and on the other, it cannot allow interest rates to rise. Social Security, Medicare, and the military budget have become politically untouchable. Both Republicans and Democrats refuse to make the necessary cuts or raise taxes enough to matter. The math is so fundamentally broken that by 2030, Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments alone are projected to exceed total tax revenue. Everything else, defense, education, infrastructure, will have to be borrowed, guaranteeing the spiral continues accelerating. This is where the interest rate trap becomes lethal. The U.S. currently pays $1.1 trillion in annual interest, a figure only manageable because interest rates remain historically low. If the Federal Reserve were forced to raise rates to historical averages, say 5% to combat inflation, interest payments would instantly hit $2 trillion annually. This $2 trillion cost would consume 30% of revenue, immediately satisfying the conditions of Stage 4. Math breaks with a speed and severity that dwarfs the crises faced by Spain or the Ottomans. The entire budget structure would collapse, validating the historical pattern with mechanical precision. The consequence is that the U.S. is forced to follow Japan's path, printing money to monetize its own debt and keep rates low, a strategy that guarantees continued debt growth and eventually destroys the currency. Compounding this internal trap is the external erosion of confidence. This is the lenders lose confidence component of Stage 5. For decades, the world accepted the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, implicitly trusting that America would always pay its debts. That trust is now fracturing. Key foreign creditors are slowly but systematically reducing their exposure to U.S. debt. China, a massive holder of U.S. treasuries, has reduced its holdings by $300 billion since 2021. This is not a sudden panic, but a slow, calculated retreat, the world quietly preparing for America to fail. Simultaneously, geopolitical architects are actively developing alternatives to the dollar-centric system. The BRICS nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and expanding allies are openly developing alternative payment systems and dollar alternatives. They are moving reserves into gold and other assets, strategically preparing for a world where the U.S. Treasury bond is no longer the undisputed safe haven. This external pressure ensures that when the U.S. hits the inevitable fiscal crisis, there will be no international rescue, unlike the European powers that temporarily propped up the Ottoman Empire. The illusion that the U.S. is different because of its reserve currency status is the final, most dangerous stage of imperial delusion. The pattern does not care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot borrow more than you produce forever, and you cannot have debt service exceed revenue. With $36 trillion in debt and an addition of $2 trillion annually, the mathematics of the spiral is now locked in. If debt continues at the current pace, the U.S. will have $50 trillion in debt by 2030. At a 5% interest rate, that equals $2.5 trillion annually just in interest no principal repayment. That would consume 40% of tax revenue. There is no fixing this with growth. It would require 6 to 7% sustained GDP growth for decades, something the U.S. hasn't achieved since the 1960 seconds. There is no fixing it with spending cuts. The political will is absent. The architects of American finance have simply postponed the crisis by transferring the burden to the next generation and relying on the illusion of stability. The United States is now a sovereign entity trapped by its own debt, operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. History says we are in Stage 5. The only question remaining is the timing of the transition to Stage 6. The final act of the debt spiral is not a matter of politics or policy. It is the mechanical consequence of Stage 5 failure. We must now confront the inevitable arrival of Stage 6, default, hyperinflation, or lost decades, and the subsequent Stage 7, economic collapse or permanent decline, the endpoints for Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. For the United States, the descent into Stage 6 is not a question of if, but how and when. The political refusal to cut spending or raise taxes to meet the reality of the $36 trillion debt means that the math is already broken. The pattern dictates that the U.S. will face a forced choice, and the options are all catastrophic. The first option is outright default. While technically impossible for a nation that borrows in its own currency, a functional default occurs when the government prioritizes interest payments over core social functions. If interest payments consume 40% of tax revenue by 2030, the government's ability to fund its military, infrastructure, and discretionary spending will be functionally wiped out. The historical precedent is clear. Spain faced 4 defaults, which led to imperial decline. The Ottoman Empire faced a default that resulted in foreign control and dissolution. The second, and more likely, option for the U.S. is hyperinflation. Since the U.S. is trapped in Stage 5, unable to raise interest rates without bankrupting the budget, the Federal Reserve is compelled to continue monetizing the debt-printing money to buy treasury bonds and suppress rates. This process of indefinite printing to sustain the Ponzi phase is what breaks the currency. Once lenders both domestic and foreign realize that the dollars they receive back are rapidly losing purchasing power, confidence collapses completely. The currency breaks from too much printing, and the result is the destruction of savings, fixed incomes, and the financial foundation of the middle class. The third possibility is the Japanese path. Lost decades. This is a slow, agonizing stagnation where wages never rise, investment dries up, and the country becomes permanently diminished. Japan avoided a sudden collapse, but paid for it with 35 years of stagnation. Given the global demand for the dollar, the U.S. may be able to prolong its decline, but it will suffer the same demographic and fiscal deterioration that Japan is now experiencing. The elites who designed this system, the architects of infinite debt, always believed they were different. Spain believed the silver would save them. It didn't. The Ottomans believed European powers would bail them out. They didn't. Japan believed they could print forever without consequence. They were wrong. The pattern is absolute, and it dictates that the United States cannot escape the spiral once it is in Stage 5. The crucial, terrifying difference between the U.S. and the historical empires is that when the United States hits Stage 6 and 7, it will not be an isolated imperial event. The entire global financial system is built on the foundation of U.S. debt and the dollar. When the U.S. fails, the world fails with it. The collapse will not be gradual. It will be a crisis that makes the 2008 financial meltdown look like a warm-up. The empire, as we understand it, the prosperity, the power, the future will be gone forever. The answers to the future of the U.S. economy aren't hiding in complex projections. They are written in the past, in the exact sequence of bankruptcy and collapse that destroyed Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and locked Japan into decades of slow death. History says we are next. This mechanical failure, the moment when the debt crisis becomes undeniable, is no longer distant speculation. It is an economic certainty waiting for the political mechanism to break. Whether it is a hard default, an explosion of hyperinflation, or the final locking in of lost decades, the fate of the American empire is sealed by the mathematics of the debt spiral. If this journey through history and high finance has opened your eyes to where we actually are in the debt spiral, it is imperative to understand the dynamics that will define the next decade. The architects of this crisis rely on the public's complacency, but the evidence of the pattern is overwhelming and undeniable. The time for denial is over. The moment the math breaks completely is the moment the financial security of every household is destroyed. Preparation demands understanding, and understanding requires facing the immutable, shocking truth written in the collapses of the empires that came before us.